Tech Cocktail Sessions, educational and inspirational talks from experienced startup founders, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders.
Thanks, Frank. So I'm going to start out my talk with an assertion that I think pretty much everybody in this room is going to agree with, right? Which is that my life as a consumer has gone through unbelievably cool changes in the last 10 years. I mean, if you really think what we've done in 10 years as a society in terms of what we've been able to innovate on, right? Twitter didn't exist, Facebook didn't exist. You know, Steve Jobs was desperately making candy-colored iMacs to try to save Apple. You know, Microsoft was still dominant, and Google was a cool search engine that couldn't find a business model, right? Amazon at that point was still selling shoes or books primarily, and not sure if they really had a scalable business model. And you know, and we've made all these incredible changes, and I can now use my iPhone to connect up with friends all over the world in all these incredible ways. I can procure services in ways that I couldn't imagine. And most importantly, all these technologies have made me as a consumer so much more powerful in the face of large corporations, suppliers, producers than I ever was 10 years ago. And all that's happened in a really short period of time. So the second assertion I'm going to make is that my life as a citizen still basically sucks as bad as it did 2-3 decades ago, right? I mean, if you really think about it, the way in which we educate our children, the way in which we manage our health care, where our energy supplies come from, how we manage energy efficiency, the way our government works, our political processes are all still as fucked as they were 30 years ago, right? And this is really profound. I mean, if you actually look at some of the data, it's mind-boggling, right? And we get all this rhetoric in America, but we don't really dig in and understand it. So you look at education. I mean, we spend 50% more as a country per student than any other OECD country in America. And when you look at the data, we have basically mediocre results, right? It's not a question of funding and spending. It's a question of the way in which our fundamental education system's structured is not producing the kind of results that we need. It's wildly more so in healthcare, right? We spend twice as much as any other country per patient, and we have results at the very bottom of the OECD, right? Same thing holds true in energy efficiency. 57% of all the energy produced in America goes to waste, right? Manufacturing processes, residential waste, light bulbs, all these things. You know, if you look at our political process, we spent 27 times more per citizen in our most recent general election than the UK did in their most recent general election. And they seem to have a pretty vibrant democracy, right? So we have all these huge problems. Why haven't they been solved, right? We obviously need to figure out how can we take this incredible innovation that's occurring in our consumer lives and apply it to our citizen lives, right? We need a consumerization of our public sector. We need the ability for all of these crazy technologists and entrepreneurs and strategists to apply all this innovation to these big problems. So why doesn't it really work? Well, because by definition, all these areas, right? All of these areas of my life as a citizen are regulated, right? And the challenge of how do you actually innovate in the regulated sectors is much more complex than the challenge of how do you regulate in the non-regulated sectors, right? How do you regulate in simply retail or media areas like that? To be successful in the regulated sectors, you not only need to have a great idea and a business model that can scale and something that's highly compelling to consumers, data to optimize what you're doing, all the things you need in the consumer world, you also need to actually understand the regulatory framework, these environments. You need to actually understand and know the right people that can negotiate things. You may need people that can help you change these structures in certain cases, right? It's a different world. But the opportunities are huge, right? If you think about it, the regulated sectors are approximately 50% of our entire economy. Education alone in America is a $1 trillion market. Healthcare is about $1.2 trillion. You know, if you put that into comparison, the entire consumer ad spend on the internet is, depending on how you define it, somewhere between 50 and 70 billion, right? So you have all this activity right now in our economy that's really, really chasing this consumer space, which is relatively small. And then you have this massive part of our economy which is completely fucked. And to me, that's a huge opportunity, right? To really redirect a lot of this towards it. So how do we go about doing that? Well, I'm a DC guy, right? I was born in DC, I was raised in DC, I went away to Europe and wandered the earth for like 5 years, and I chose to come back to DC. And the interesting thing to me about DC is, I have all these different networks, right? So I have my totally cool, hipster, startup-y, like underground scene friends, like Jen and Frank and Navroop and a number of you guys in the room, right? The Baltimore scene. And they're all doing all this great startup stuff, right? And then I have my like K Street political White House friends, and they're doing really cool stuff. And they're trying to think through all these problems and launch all these big policies and do stuff. And the interesting aspect is the overlap between those two communities, even within one city, is almost non-existent. Even if they're in the same geographic area, they're not going to the same places, they're not speaking the same language. They wouldn't even know if they were necessarily talking about the same idea because the very words and terms they use are often different. And so for the past year, I've been sort of launching these little experiments, right? So we launched this experiment called K Street Capital, right? Could we actually get lobbyists, which is a large demographic of wealthy, connected people in our city, to start investing in startups? Well, the fascinating thing to me was once we actually started asking them, they were really excited about it. Right? This was really cool for them. It was a way for them to take their wealth and take their connections and, you know, go do other stuff that was meaningful and important, kind of like anybody else would approach it. And in fact, the biggest response we've gotten was, well, nobody ever asked me before. I never saw any deal flow. It's just not part of my world. So we did that experiment. Then we launched this other experiment where we did sort of this whole Reboot America event series. We had support from American Airlines and Tech Cocktail and a lot of people. And the interesting thing there was, again, we got all these startups together tackling these problems, together with all these sort of big corporate people and policymakers. And what was fascinating to me is you had people from the White House who have an agenda about innovation in healthcare, an agenda about innovation in education and all these things. And you had all these startups, and the people from the White House didn't even know these startups existed, right? So you had this really cool startup called WeRx, which is crowdsourcing through a mobile app, transparency in prescription drug pricing. Well, it's a huge part of the president's agenda, but the White House didn't even know this existed and was going off on all these other plans, which would probably cost, you know, $3 billion, right? Because it's government. And so that was really interesting. And the thing to me in launching all these experiments was that there's something really powerful there in figuring out how we connect these communities and reorient things, but we needed a bigger idea. We needed something that was much more powerful to kind of convene and reorient these communities and really rebrand Washington from, you know, a place that's obviously really powerful, right? I mean, if you think about it, every major corporation in the world, every NGO in the world, every government in the world, every government agency in the US has a direct relationship into Washington, D.C. That's this incredible nexus of relationships. But those relationships aren't being used in the right way, right? How do we reorient things? It was interesting to me. I asked Aziz, I'm trying to spot you in the audience, but I asked Aziz, we were talking about different cities from his perspective as a venture capitalist, like what was their brand? And he was talking about Chicago's brand and Cincinnati's brand and LA's brand and New York's brand. And I was like, well, I'm just curious as an outsider, like, what's DC's brand? And he was like, well, I guess you have a lot of defense companies. And I was like, yeah, we do have a lot of defense companies, but we also have all these incredible education startups and health startups doing these cool things. So our big idea, what I've sort of brought together a team to do and what we're tackling starting in February of next year is 1776. And so there's 4 big parts to what we're doing, right? The first is we're launching the 1776 campus. So we've actually taken 36,000 square feet, a few blocks from the White House, and we're turning it into sort of our own mecca, right, for the entire startup and innovation community in Washington. So there actually is a place that all these parts can come to where we can actually show people. And we've got Georgetown University and George Washington University. We're going to have the hub in there. Springboard, which is a big accelerator for women entrepreneurs, is going to be located. Tech Cocktail's DC offices are going to be there, right? We got about 15 startups that are already joining in. So we're going to bring all these things together into one physical place where we can have events, where we can convene, where we can do all that. The second part is we have to actually like educate, right? And so we're doing 2 things there. One is we're actually we have a lot of media talent, right, in DC. So we're actually going to start creating content around educating people on what's happening, right? So in one direction, that's educating all these sort of inside Washington people around what are the trends, what's actually happening, what innovation is really occurring out in the world in these big problem areas. In the other direction, we're going to try to figure out how to actually educate startups about all this stuff they don't necessarily understand. It's interesting to me, I mentor a number of healthcare startups, and it's great because a lot of them start from this perspective of, I'm as a patient, I'm frustrated, and I have a new idea, and I have a solution, I have something I want to do. And it's a really good idea. And then I'm like, that's awesome. Do you understand what an accountable care organization is, or how Medicare scoring works, or what HIPAA really means to your strategy for gathering data and how you're going to store it? And the answer is often, well, not really. And that's really central to their question of can they create a scalable business model. So being able to create the content to educate is huge. The final part of what we're doing is actually launching Accelerator, where we're going to be partnering with other top-tier accelerators across the country. So our goal isn't to be a Techstars or a 500. Our goal is to take awesome startups from those places that are graduating, say in energy or health or education, and bring them to Washington to really get them hyper-connected up into the network that they need to really scale and excel and actually drive innovation into these big areas. So that's my big idea, and thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Evan. Great, Evan.